What if I told you that Five Nights at Freddy's creator Scott Cawthon doesn't remember what's inside the franchise's most infamous locked box? That the story you've been trying to solve for over a decade contains mysteries even its creator can't answer anymore? Welcome to the strange reality of FNAF lore, where some threads were designed to dangle forever, and others simply got lost in the shuffle of the expanding universe that grew far beyond anyone's original vision. At the end of Five Nights at Freddy's 4, after surviving the nightmare that was Night 7, players were greeted with an image that would haunt the community for years. A locked box. 2 locks securing whatever secrets lay inside, and above it, a simple message. Perhaps some things are best left forgotten for now. That final phrase, "for now," suggested a promise, a future revelation. The community believed they just needed to solve the right puzzle, find the right clues, and eventually the box would open. They were wrong. For nearly a decade, theorists examined every pixel of FNAF 4, searching for keys that didn't exist. Data miners discovered an open sprite of the box in the game files, confirming that at some point, Scott Cawthon intended for it to be unlocked. The FNAF world files contain similar assets, suggesting connections that were never fully realized. The community developed elaborate theories about what the box contained. Some believed it held the true identity of the crying child. Others thought it contained remnant, that supernatural substance that would later become crucial to the lore. Still others theorized it was purely metaphorical, so representing memories that the crying child, or perhaps the player themselves, had locked away. In August 2024, during an interview with YouTuber Darko, as part of FNAF's 10th anniversary celebrations, Scott finally addressed the box. His answer wasn't what anyone expected. "There is something in the box," he confirmed, "but I never pursued that, and I don't know if I can find it again, and I think that's the best answer that I can possibly give for that." Think about that for a moment. The creator of the franchise, the architect of this intricate mystery, openly admitted he's forgotten what was supposed to be inside one of the series' most debated elements. This wasn't a cryptic tease or a clever deflection. It was a genuine confession that whatever he'd originally planned had been lost somewhere in the evolution of the story. Scott elaborated further in previous interviews, particularly one with Darko years earlier, where he discussed how YouTuber MatPat was absolutely right when theorizing that the contents of the box had changed over time. Scott explained how the story evolved between conceptualization and the community's reaction to it, how he wanted to try to craft it into something better. The problem, in crafting that something better, the original purpose of the box got left behind. This revelation fundamentally changed how the community understood FNAF's narrative structure. For years, fans had operated under the assumption that Scott had everything planned out, that every detail was intentional, that every mystery had a solution waiting to be discovered. The box proved otherwise. Here was concrete evidence that some mysteries existed not because they were meant to be solved, but because they were remnants of abandoned plot threads. The community had spent thousands of hours analyzing something that, by Scott's own admission, might not have a canonical answer anymore. What makes the box particularly fascinating is what it represents about FNAF's development philosophy. When Scott released FNAF 4 in July 2015, it was marketed as the final chapter. The box was supposed to be the final piece of the puzzle, the revelation that would make everything click into place. But FNAF 4 didn't end the franchise. Sister Location came next, then Pizzeria Simulator, then Ultimate Custom Night, and the story continued expanding in directions Scott likely never anticipated back in 2015, and the community's reaction to Scott's confession was mixed. Some felt vindicated. Their suspicions confirmed that not everything in FNAF was as carefully planned as it seemed. Others felt disappointed, even betrayed, having invested years into solving a mystery that turned out to be unsolvable. Many simply found it darkly humorous that the franchise built on hidden lore and secret revelations contained a secret so well hidden that even its creator couldn't find it anymore. The retcon revelation. In a Reddit post that sent shockwaves through the theory community, Scott Cawthon made a startling admission. He had done one true retcon in the series, one deliberate change to previously established facts. The catch? He wouldn't say what it was, and this single statement created a theoretical black hole that the community is still trying to escape from years later. The exact wording matters here. Scott distinguished between retcons, actual changes to establish canon, and clarifications, where later games provided context that cleared up misunderstandings from earlier entries. He insisted that he'd only done one true retcon, and that most people didn't notice it. If it had caused problems or confusion, he would have addressed it. This statement immediately sparked heated debate, because plenty of things in FNAF seem contradictory, and now everyone could potentially explain away inconsistencies by claiming that must be the retcon. The leading theories about what this mysterious retcon might be vary wildly in scope and impact. One popular candidate involves William Afton's arrest. The newspapers in the original FNAF state that the killer was caught and convicted, with actual camera evidence of the murders. Yet later games show William free and able to commit more crimes, eventually becoming Springtrap. Did Scott originally intend for the killer to be imprisoned, only to retcon this detail when he decided to continue the story? The evidence supports this theory, but it's never been confirmed. Another theory focuses on the identity of the Bite of 87 victim. For years, the community debated whether FNAF 4 showed the Bite of 83 or the Bite of 87. Evidence points strongly toward 1983, confirmed by the copyright date on the Fredbear and Friends show and various other clues. But if FNAF 4 was meant to show the Bite of 87 initially, and Scott changed it to 1983 after release or during development, that would constitute a significant retcon. The problem with this theory is that the discrepancy was noticed immediately and extensively discussed, contradicting Scott's claim that most people didn't notice the retcon. Some theorists propose that the retcon involves the puppet's gender. In FNAF 2, the minigame is titled Save Him, suggesting the puppet spirit is male. But FNAF 6 establishes definitively that the puppet is possessed by Charlotte Emily, Henry's daughter. The gender change from male to female would be a relatively minor retcon, which might explain why Scott said most people didn't notice. However, this seems almost too small to be worth mentioning as the one major retcon. A more complex theory suggests that the nature of the missing children incident itself was retconned. Originally, 5 children were killed and stuffed into the animatronic suits, possessing them. But some believe Scott changed whether the crying child was one of those 5, or if he became Golden Freddy, through different circumstances. The exact mechanics of who possesses Golden Freddy, whether it's one spirit or 2, has been debated extensively, and clarifying or changing this could have required adjustments to earlier lore. What makes the retcon issue particularly frustrating is how it can be weaponized in lore discussions. Anytime someone points out an inconsistency, others can simply respond, "That's probably the retcon," effectively shutting down analysis. This creates a situation where contradictions in the timeline can be hand-waved away rather than examined critically. Some fans have argued that Scott has actually made multiple retcons, not just one, pointing to various changes in animatronic designs, timeline shifts, and character backstories across the series. The sister location era introduced several elements that seem to contradict earlier lore. The existence of Circus Baby's Pizza World, happening before or concurrent with some early locations, created timeline confusion. The revelation that there were multiple purple guys, William and his son Michael, required recontextualizing earlier appearances of purple figures in minigames. The scooping and Michael's subsequent decay into a purple corpse explained why the Night Guard in FNAF 1 has purple eyes in one rare screen, but this detail seemed like a retroactive justification rather than original intent. And Scott's statement about using sister location to clear up a misconception from FNAF 4 suggests he was actively trying to guide the community toward correct interpretations. But the line between clarification and retcon becomes blurry when the clarification requires adding entirely new context that wasn't apparent in the original game. If FNAF 4's story only makes sense after sister location provides essential missing information, does that count as clarification or alteration? The community's relationship with the retcon admission is complicated by Scott's general communication style. He rarely provides direct answers, preferring to let the community theorize and discover. This approach works brilliantly for creating engagement and discussion, but it also means that when something genuinely changes or gets abandoned, and there's no clear way to distinguish that from intentionally obscure storytelling. The retcon could be something major that fundamentally changes our understanding of events, or it could be something so minor that it's meaningless in the grand scheme of things. What's undeniable is that FNAF's lore has evolved significantly from what was likely planned in 2014 when the first game released. Scott didn't expect FNAF to become a massive franchise. The original game was meant to be his last shot at game development after years of failed projects. Its explosive success led to rapid sequel development, with FNAF 2 releasing just 3 months after FNAF 1. This breakneck pace continued through FNAF 4, and while Scott is remarkably talented at weaving together story threads, it's unrealistic to expect that he had 7, 8, and 9 games worth of lore meticulously planned from the beginning. The retcon issue represents a fundamental tension in FNAF theorizing. Do we treat the lore as a perfectly constructed puzzle box, where every piece fits together if we're clever enough? Or do we acknowledge that it's a living story that's changed and grown organically, sometimes leaving behind inconsistencies and abandoned ideas? The answer probably lies somewhere in between, but without knowing what the one true retcon actually is, the community remains stuck in an endless debate about which contradictions matter and which can be explained away. When canon becomes a question mark, perhaps no aspect of FNAF lore generates more heated debate than the relationship between the games and the books. Are they the same continuity, different timelines, parallel universes with shared elements? Scott's statements on the matter have been simultaneously clarifying and confusing, creating a situation where fans can't agree on what's even allowed to be used as evidence in lore discussions. When The Silver Eyes released in December 2015, it presented a version of the FNAF story that was clearly different from the games. Charlie, the main character, had a completely different backstory than anything seen in the games. The timeline didn't match up. Events unfolded in ways that contradicted game lore. The community was understandably confused until Scott addressed it directly on Reddit, stating that the games and books should be considered separate continuities, even if they share familiar elements. This seemed straightforward enough at the time. The Charlie Trilogy, The Silver Eyes, The Twisted Ones, and The Fourth Closet was its own alternate universe retelling of FNAF events. Fans could enjoy the books as a different take on the story without worrying about how they fit into game canon. Problem solved, right? Not quite. As the book series expanded beyond the Charlie Trilogy, things got murkier. The Fazbear Fright series, which began releasing in 2019, was marketed differently. These weren't alternate retellings. They were short stories set in various corners of the FNAF universe. The epilogues of each book told a continuing story about the Stitch Wraith, clearly taking place after the events of Pizzeria Simulator and referencing game events directly. This wasn't an alternate continuity. It was expanding on game lore. Then came Tales from the Pizzaplex, and which introduced crucial characters like the Mimic that would later appear in the games themselves. The Mimic's backstory, established in Tales from the Pizzaplex, seemed essential to understanding Security Breach and its DLC, Ruin. How could this not be canon if the games directly reference it? Scott attempted to clarify in January 2024 after a fake email circulated claiming he'd confirmed specific books as canon. In a Reddit comment, he addressed the situation, but his clarification was itself somewhat ambiguous. He mentioned that different books exist in different corners of series canon, and that while some stories might connect to the games and novel trilogy, others don't. This confirmed that not everything in Fazbear Frights or Tales from the Pizzaplex is meant to be taken as game canon, but it didn't specify which stories were and weren't. This creates an impossible situation for theorists. If you're trying to understand, say, how Remnant works, can you use information from the Fazbear Fright story that explains it in detail? Some would say yes, because Remnant exists in the games, and the books provide clarification. Others would say no, because that book might be in a different continuity corner and could contradict how it actually works in the games. There's no definitive answer. The community has developed various approaches to handle this. Some theorists use books only when games confirm the same information independently, treating books as supplementary rather than primary evidence. Others create elaborate frameworks where certain types of information, like mechanical explanations or character motivations, can be pulled from books even if specific events can't. Still, others reject book evidence entirely, arguing that if it's not explicitly shown in a game, it's not game canon. This debate intensified with Security Breach's release. The game clearly expects players to understand concepts from the books. Glitchtrap's nature as a mimic program, Vanny's backstory, the blob of animatronic parts in the underground. All of these make more sense with book context. But the game doesn't explain these connections explicitly, leaving players who only engage you with the games confused about fundamental plot points. The situation is further complicated by Scott's evolving role in the franchise. After announcing his retirement from game development in 2021, he's primarily focused on the book series, while Steel Wool Studios handles game development. This creates questions about whose vision is canon. If Steel Wool creates something in a game that contradicts a book Scott wrote, which takes precedence? If Scott provides lore in a book that Steel Wool doesn't incorporate into the games, is it still relevant? Then there's the movie continuity. which Matthew Lillard, who plays William Afton, mentioned, has its own Bible to follow. So now we have game continuity, Charlie Trilogy continuity, Fazbear Fright continuity corners, Tales from the Pizzaplex continuity corners, and movie continuity, all existing simultaneously in the FNAF universe. For new fans trying to understand the lore, this is absolutely overwhelming, and the practical effect of this canonical chaos is that FNAF theory discussions often devolve into arguments about what sources are valid before the actual theorizing can even begin. Someone proposes a theory using book evidence. Someone else rejects it because books aren't canon. The first person responds that Scott said books exist in corners of canon, and around it goes. The lack of a clear, definitive statement about what is and isn't canon to the games means that no theory can be definitively proven or disproven using book evidence. What's particularly frustrating is that some book concepts are unquestionably important to understanding the games. The mimic appearing in Security Breach proves that at least some Tales from the Pizzaplex content is directly relevant. But which parts? All of it. Just the mimic-specific stories, and only the broad strokes of the mimic's backstory. The game doesn't answer these questions, leaving theorists to guess. This canonical ambiguity also affects how we understand character motivations and story themes. The books often provide emotional depth and psychological complexity that the games, limited by their horror gameplay format, can't easily convey. If we can't use that depth to inform our understanding of game characters, we're left with a much more surface-level interpretation. But if we do use it, and we're wrong about which parts are canon, we might be building theories on a foundation of irrelevant information. The timeline that doesn't add up. One of FNAF's most persistent and maddening problems is that its timeline simply doesn't work, no matter how you arrange it. Our fans have spent years trying to create a coherent chronology of events, but every attempt runs into contradictions that seem impossible to resolve. Some of these issues might stem from Scott changing his plans mid-series. Others might be intentional ambiguity. But the result is a timeline that, when examined closely, contains glaring impossibilities. The most infamous timeline problem involves the toy animatronics appearing in FNAF 4's minigames. FNAF 4 is definitively set in 1983, confirmed by multiple pieces of evidence including the Fredbear and Friends, TV show copyright date, and the 1983 code in Sister Location's private room. The crying child story, his fear of the animatronics, his birthday party, and his tragic death all occur in 1983. This is as close to confirmed as anything gets in FNAF. But here's the problem. The toy animatronics appear as toys and merchandise in FNAF 4's minigames. Children have toy versions of Toy Bonnie, Toy Chica, and the other updated animatronics. These toys are in the crying child's bedroom. Yet according to FNAF 2's phone calls, the toy animatronics were only created in 1987 as part of a new restaurant opening. Phone Guy explicitly states that the company decided to go in a whole new direction with the toy animatronics, retrofitting them with new technology. This was a recent decision, not something that happened 4 years earlier. The community has developed various explanations to reconcile this contradiction. One theory suggests that the toy animatronics existed as toys and merchandise before they became actual animatronics. That's similar to how the Fredbear and Friends TV show in 1983 featured characters that later became robots. Another theory proposes that FNAF 4's minigames actually take place in 1987, not 1983. despite all the evidence pointing to 1983. A third approach argues that there were multiple restaurant locations with different animatronics, and the toys existed in some form earlier than we realize. None of these explanations are entirely satisfying. The toy first theory requires us to believe that a failing restaurant company was producing elaborate merchandise 4 years before actually implementing those designs as animatronics, which doesn't make business sense. The 1987 theory contradicts the mountain of evidence placing FNAF 4 in 1983. The multiple locations theory lacks supporting evidence and just shifts the problem elsewhere. This isn't the only timeline issue. The placement of sister location in the chronology has been debated endlessly. Does it take place before FNAF 1, after FNAF 1, or somewhere in between other games? The evidence points in multiple directions. Michael Afton's appearance suggests it happens after FNAF 1, since he's working as Mike Schmidt there. But the existence of Circus Baby's Pizza World and its closure suggests it happened earlier in the timeline. The mechanics of how Remnant works, and when William experimented with it, create additional complications. Then there's the question of how the FNAF 6 location ended up underground beneath the Pizzaplex in Security Breach. The Pizzaplex is massive, mall-sized, and sits directly above a sinkhole containing the burned remains of the FNAF 6 pizzeria. But FNAF 6 shows the pizzeria burning in what appears to be a controlled fire set by Henry Emily. How did this fire create a sinkhole? Why would they build the Pizzaplex directly on top of it? The logistics make no sense, but the games clearly show this is what happened. The time span between games also creates problems. Security Breach appears to take place in 2035 based on calendar evidence showing March 9th falling on a Friday, which 2035 is the earliest possible year for After Help Wanted's development timeframe. But this creates a massive gap between FNAF 6 in 2023 and Security Breach in 2035. What was Fazbear Entertainment doing for 12 years? How did they rebuild their reputation enough to create the Pizzaplex? Why did it take so long for the Mimic to become active again? Dating earlier games creates additional headaches. FNAF 2 clearly takes place in November 1987 based on the paychecks. FNAF 1 is commonly placed in 1993, about 30 years before FNAF 3 in 2023. But reconciling the order of events, which location opened when, and how the missing children incident fits into this timeline requires some logical gymnastics. The original location, the FNAF 2 location, the FNAF 1 location, they all have evidence suggesting different chronological orders depending on how you interpret various clues. Fredbear's Family Diner supposedly opened in the 1970s, with some evidence pointing to 1973 specifically. But the exact relationship between Fredbear's and the original Freddy Fazbear's Pizza is unclear. Did they exist simultaneously? Did one become the other? Were they owned by the same company from the start? Or did Fazbear Entertainment acquire Fredbear's? Our phone guy's statement that the animatronics had been around for 20 years by FNAF 1 suggests an early start, but this creates complications with other established dates. William Afton's murder timeline is another mess. The puppet minigame shows Charlotte's death happening before the other missing children. But when exactly did the 5 main missing children die? Was it 1985, as many theorize? Earlier? Later? The Follow Me minigames in FNAF 3 show William destroying the animatronics and getting spring-locked. But when does this happen relative to other events? It must be before FNAF 1, since the safe room is sealed, but the exact timing is unclear. The most fundamental problem is that Scott likely didn't have the entire timeline mapped out when he started. FNAF was supposed to be one game, maybe two. The rapid expansion of the series meant that dates, locations, and events were added retroactively, sometimes without full consideration for how they fit with earlier established facts. This created a timeline that works in broad strokes but falls apart under close examination. Different fan timelines resolve these contradictions in different ways, prioritizing certain evidence over others, interpreting ambiguous clues differently, and sometimes just accepting that certain things don't make perfect sense. The FNAF wiki has multiple timeline theories laid out. Major theorists like MatPat have revised their timelines numerous times as new games provided new context. No one has created a timeline that accounts for every single detail without requiring some assumptions or ignoring some contradictory evidence. For Security Breach, the law that broke. When Five Nights at Freddy's, Security Breach released on December 16th, 2021, it was supposed to be a triumphant evolution of the franchise. The biggest FNAF game ever made, free roam gameplay in a massive location, next-gen graphics, and a story that would move the series forward after the seeming conclusion in Pizzeria Simulator. Instead, it became one of the most divisive and confusing entries in the franchise, creating more questions than answers and leaving the community frustrated and divided. The game's troubled development is now well documented. Originally planned for a December 2020 release, Security Breach was delayed multiple times as Steel Wool Studios struggled with the ambitious scope. The COVID-19 pandemic complicated development, and internal miscommunications between Scott Cawthon and the development team led to significant problems with the final product story. In a later interview, Scott admitted that he had a specific story in mind for Security Breach and told Steel Wool to put pieces in specific places for fans to connect. But due to how he communicated this, Steel Wool was given pieces with little information about how to use them and built a different story than Scott intended. When the game finally released, players immediately noticed something was off. The lore seemed disconnected from previous games. Plot threads from Help Wanted and FNAFAR weren't addressed. Character motivations made no sense. Multiple endings contradicted each other. And worst of all, massive amounts of content had clearly been cut from the game, leaving the story feeling incomplete and incoherent. Data miners uncovered extensive cut content, including dialogue that would have explained crucial plot points. Voice lines from Vanessa discussing her backstory, Gregory's origins, and the nature of the Pizzaplex's infection by Glitchtrap were all present in the files, but not in the actual game. Steel Wool had apparently made late-stage changes to create a more family-friendly tone, removing darker elements and altering critical story moments. This resulted in a narrative that felt disjointed and confusing, with setup for revelations that never came. The Vanny situation exemplifies the game's narrative problems. Vanny, Vanessa's alter ego controlled by Glitchtrap, was heavily featured in promotional material and teasers as the game's primary antagonist. She appeared terrifying, hunting Gregory through the Pizzaplex with a knife. But in the actual game, Vanny has minimal screen time and poses little threat. Her story isn't explained. The relationship between Vanessa and Vanny isn't clarified. Players who expected her to be a major antagonist were left disappointed. Burntrap's inclusion created even more confusion. The boss fight ending shows what appears to be William Afton in a new, decayed Springtrap form, attached to a charging station underground. This seems to contradict the supposed finality of his defeat in Pizzeria Simulator and his torment in Ultimate Custom Night. Is this really William? How did he survive? Why is he here? The game provides no answers, and later revelations about the mimic suggest that Burntrap might not even be William at all, adding another layer of confusion. The blob, and that massive amalgamation of molten animatronic parts from FNAF 6, appears briefly to grab Burntrap before disappearing. What is it doing down there? Is it sentient? Does it remember anything? Again, no explanation. It just exists as a shocking visual callback to previous games, without any narrative purpose or context. Gregory's identity and motivations are never properly explained in the base game. Why is he at the Pizzaplex? Where are his parents? The various endings provide contradictory information. One suggests he's homeless, another shows him living with Vanessa and Glamrock Freddy in a normal house. Another has him escaping on a hill with Freddy's head. Which ending is canon? The Ruin DLC later suggests that the Princess Quest ending, where Gregory, Vanessa, and Freddy escape together, is the true ending. But this wasn't clear from the base game. The Pizzaplex itself raises questions. It's built directly on top of the FNAF 6 pizzeria's remains, which somehow ended up in a sinkhole. The game never explains how or why this happened. The animatronics are infected with Glitchtrap's virus, making them aggressive, but the mechanics of this infection aren't explained. Glamrock Freddy is immune because he rebooted in safe mode, but why he rebooted in the first place is unclear. What's particularly frustrating is that many of these questions could have been answered with the cut content. Voice lines in the files reference Gregory being broken, Freddy remembering him, and questions about why he's not in the customer database. These lines hint at the theory that Gregory might be a robot, possibly created by William Afton, or containing the consciousness of the crying child. But this is never confirmed or denied in the actual game. The community's reaction was overwhelmingly negative regarding the story, even though many enjoyed the gameplay. Theory channels struggled to make sense of the narrative. Reddit threads became therapy sessions for people trying to understand what happened. The general consensus was that Security Breach felt like an unfinished product rushed out to meet holiday sales deadlines, with a story that had been gutted and reassembled so many times it lost coherence. Steel Wool acknowledged the issues and promised that the Ruin DLC would address them. When Ruin released in July 2023, it did provide more clarity and returned to the series' darker tone. It confirmed some theories, introduced the mimic properly, and provided context that the base game lacked. But Ruin also introduced new confusions and ended on a cliffhanger, leaving Cassie's fate uncertain. Scott's admission that he and Steel Wool had miscommunicated explains a lot, but doesn't excuse the final product state. Security Breach represents a low point in FNAF storytelling, where the lore became so fractured and confusing that even dedicated fans couldn't piece together what was happening. It proved that the franchise had grown beyond what could be effectively managed without clear communication and a unified vision. Burntrap, Glitchtrap, or the Mimic. Few aspects of modern FNAF lore generate more heated debate than the true identity of the entities appearing in the Steel Wool era games. Is Burntrap actually William Afton? Is Glitchtrap a digital copy of William? Or is it the Mimic program? Are these all the same entity or different characters? The community remains deeply divided on these questions, with evidence supporting multiple interpretations. The confusion begins in Help Wanted with Glitchtrap's introduction. This rabbit-suited entity appears in the VR game, clearly malevolent, manipulating testers, and eventually possessing or controlling Vanessa. His appearance resembles Spring Bonnie, William's suit, and his behavior mimics William's murderous nature. The natural assumption was that this was William Afton, somehow returned in digital form, his consciousness, or remnant, scanned from circuit boards taken from old animatronics. This interpretation seemed solid until Tales from the Pizzaplex introduced the Mimic, and this book series established that an AI program called Mimic 1 existed, designed to copy and imitate human behavior. The Mimic program was scanned into the Help Wanted game along with old circuit boards, where it encountered data from William's crimes and began imitating him. According to this explanation, Glitchtrap isn't William at all. It's the Mimic pretending to be William, copying his patterns and behaviors. Security Breach complicated things further with Burntrap. This character appears in one of the endings, a decayed animatronic rabbit in a charging station underground, clearly meant to evoke Springtrap. The character encyclopedia notably doesn't use Burntrap as his official name, leaving his identity ambiguous. Is this William Afton, somehow surviving the FNAF 6 fire through remnant or agony? Or is this the Mimic wearing a Springtrap costume, another imitation? Model analysis by fans revealed that Burntrap and the Mimic share the same arm model. The Mimic's body was built using Burntrap's model as a base, with some remnants of the costume still visible. This suggests they're connected, possibly the same entity, but it could also be a case of asset reuse by developers. Both do a similar arm gesture holding something close to their chest, which could indicate shared identity, or could just be the Mimic copying Burntrap. The debate intensified with the Ruin DLC. The Mimic appears as the main antagonist, clearly wearing different costumes and imitating voices, including Gregory's. But if the Mimic is down in the sinkhole during Ruin, where's Burntrap? The Blob appears in Ruin, having moved to upper levels, suggesting the same events from the Burntrap ending happened. But Burntrap himself is absent. Did the Blob destroy Burntrap? Did the Mimic escape the Burntrap costume? Are they separate entities that were both down there? Some theorists argue that Burntrap was William Afton, but he's now dead for good, and the Mimic is a separate threat that was imprisoned down there alongside him. Others believe Burntrap was always the Mimic in a costume, never William at all. A third camp suggests that the Mimic somehow absorbed or merged with William's agony, becoming a hybrid entity that's part AI, part remnant-infused ghost. The Glitchtrap situation is similarly unclear. Help Wanted 2 references Burntrap's charging station, suggesting Glitchtrap and Burntrap are connected. Princess Quest's ending shows defeating Glitchtrap by destroying his digital presence. If Glitchtrap is the Mimic's program and we deleted it, why is the physical Mimic still active in Ruin? Did only part of the program get deleted? Is there a backup? What complicates this further is that having the Mimic replace William as the main villain has been controversial. Many fans feel that William Afton is such an iconic antagonist that replacing him with an AI feels unsatisfying. The Mimic lacks the personal motivation and history that made William compelling. It's not evil, it's just copying what it saw. This makes it less interesting as a character to some fans, even if it's technically more threatening. Others appreciate the Mimic as a fresh direction for the franchise. William's story reached a natural conclusion in Pizzeria Simulator and Ultimate Custom Night. Bringing him back again and again diminishes the impact of his defeats. The Mimic allows the series to move forward with a new threat, while still connecting to the past. The debate over whether this was a good creative decision is separate from whether it's actually what happened in the lore. The official FNAF wiki notes that while there's evidence suggesting Mimic, Glitch Trap, and Burn Trap are all the same, they're treated as separate entities for documentation purposes until concrete evidence proves otherwise. This cautious approach reflects the community's uncertainty. Without explicit confirmation from Scott or Steel Wool, we're left interpreting ambiguous clues that could support multiple theories. And what's particularly frustrating is that this ambiguity feels unintentional rather than deliberately mysterious. The Mimic's introduction in the books was clearly meant to explain Glitch Trap and Burn Trap, but the execution in the games left enough room for doubt that large portions of the community reject this explanation. If Steel Wool wanted to clearly establish that Burn Trap was the Mimic all along, they could have made this more explicit. If they wanted to maintain William Afton as the villain, they could have clarified that. Instead, we got something in between that satisfies no one fully. The villain who replaced the villain. The introduction of the Mimic as the franchise's new primary antagonist represents one of the most controversial decisions in FNAF's history. After a decade of William Afton serving as the man behind the slaughter, the purple guy who murdered children and created the animatronic hauntings, the series attempted to pivot to a new threat. The execution of this transition has been widely criticized as confusing, unsatisfying, and potentially a creative misstep. The Mimic's backstory, primarily established in tales from the Pizzaplex, involves Edwin Murray creating an animatronic that could learn and imitate human behavior. After Edwin's son David died in a tragic accident, Edwin violently attacked the Mimic, imprinting aggression and violence into its programming. The Mimic later encountered evidence of William Afton's crimes and began imitating those murders, becoming a killer not out of malice, but because it was copying patterns it observed. And this origin makes the Mimic fundamentally different from William Afton. William had motivations, however unclear they might be. He was a person who made choices to commit evil acts. The Mimic is an AI that learned violence and death because that's what it was exposed to. It's not truly evil in the moral sense. It's malfunctioning. For many fans, this makes it a less compelling villain. The transition from William to the Mimic also felt abrupt and poorly explained. Security Breach introduced the Mimic through Burn Trap without clearly establishing what was happening. The base game expected players to understand concepts from the tales from the Pizzaplex books that many hadn't read. Casual players who only engaged with the games were left completely confused about who the actual villain was and why William seemed to be back again. The Ruin DLC improved the situation somewhat by featuring the Mimic directly as an antagonist, showing its ability to mimic voices and trick Cassie, and providing a more threatening presence. But even Ruin struggled to make the Mimic feel as iconic or memorable as William Afton in his various forms. The Mimic is creepy and dangerous, but it lacks personality. It's a tool, a threat, not a character in the way Springtrap or Scraptrap were. Critics argue that the Mimic was created specifically to retcon William Afton out of the story because Scott, or Steel Wool, decided they were done with him. The timing seems suspicious. Just when William's story should have been over after Pizzeria Simulator, a new character emerges that can perfectly explain everything William related going forward. Glitch Trap acting like William? It's the Mimic copying him. Burn Trap looking like Springtrap? It's the mimic in a costume. Vanny being manipulated. It's the mimic's program, not William's ghost. Defenders of the decision point out that William's story had run its course. He died in the fire, was tormented in ultimate custom night, and received a definitive ending. Bringing him back again would cheapen these conclusions. The mimic allows the franchise to continue without retreading the same ground, and its nature as an imitator creates interesting thematic possibilities about legacy and repetition. The problem is that the mimic replacing William wasn't clearly communicated in the games themselves. If Security Breach had explicitly shown the mimic, explained what it was, and established it as the new threat while confirming William was truly gone, the transition might have been smoother. Instead, it was ambiguous enough that many fans still believe William is somehow involved, creating confusion about who the actual villain is. Another issue is that the mimic's backstory requires knowledge from the books. Game-only fans don't know about Edwin Murray, don't understand why the mimic behaves the way it does, and can't appreciate the tragic irony of a machine built to help becoming a monster because of the violence inflicted upon it. Without this context, the mimic is just a random killer robot that appeared out of nowhere. The secret of the mimic game, releasing in 2025, appears designed to address these issues. It's giving the mimic a proper introduction in game form, establishing its personality and threat level, and hopefully making it feel like a worthy successor to William Afton as the franchise's primary antagonist. The PAX West 2024 demo introduced Jackie, a jester animatronic theorized to be connected to the mimic, suggesting the game will explore the mimic's line of animatronics and its evolution. Whether this redemption arc for the mimic as a character succeeds remains to be seen. The community is divided between those willing to give the new villain a chance and those who want William Afton to remain the central figure of FNAF's horror. Some fans have even suggested that William could possess or merge with the mimic through Remnant, creating a hybrid entity that combines the new threat with the classic villain. This would arguably be the worst of both worlds, unable to move forward or properly conclude the past. What's undeniable is that the mimic's introduction created massive confusion about the franchise's direction. The lack of clear answers about whether William is truly gone, whether the mimic has replaced him, or whether they're somehow both still active has left the lore in a state of uncertainty that even dedicated theorists struggle to navigate. Dreams, experiments, or reality? FNAF 4's gameplay sections remain one of the most debated aspects of the entire franchise. Are the nightmare animatronics literal monsters hunting a child? Are they hallucinations induced by fear? Are they part of a cruel experiment using gas and sound discs? The game provides evidence for multiple interpretations, and nearly a decade later, the community still can't agree on a definitive answer. The dream theory was one of the earliest and most popular explanations. The gameplay shows a child in a bedroom defending against nightmarish versions of the animatronics. The surreal nature of the threats, the way they behave, and the setting all suggested this might be taking place in the crying child's mind, either as nightmares before his death or in some form of coma after the bite. The nightmare Fredbear's appearance directly connects to his trauma. The bedroom layout matches his house from the minigames. It seemed to fit. But Scott Cawthon explicitly shot down the dream theory. In a Steam post, he stated that the community had missed something important, and that the story wasn't as simple as dreams. This didn't definitively disprove dreams being involved, but it indicated that if dreams were part of the answer, and there was more to it than just the kid is having nightmares. the experiment theory emerged as a more complex alternative. Evidence from sister location and the survival logbook suggests that the nightmare sequences might be part of a controlled experiment conducted by William Afton. The private room in sister location contains monitors showing the FNAF4 bedroom layout. A map shows the FNAF4 house as part of a testing facility. The breaker room has sections labeled with nightmare animatronic names. This all implies William was using equipment to induce artificial nightmares, possibly testing fear responses or trying to replicate his son's trauma for some twisted purpose. The survival logbook shows the nightmare animatronics alongside questions about recent dreams, suggesting Michael Afton experienced these nightmares. And this would mean the player in FNAF4's gameplay isn't the crying child at all, but his older brother Michael, possibly subjected to his father's experiments as punishment for causing his brother's death. The drawing of Nightmare Fredbear in the logbook supports Michael's connection to these events. Some theorists propose that sound illusion discs, introduced in the Charlie Trilogy novels, could explain the nightmare animatronics. These devices can make things appear differently than they are, potentially making regular animatronics look nightmarish. But this requires accepting technology from the books into game canon, which is controversial given Scott's statements about separate continuities. The hallucinogenic gas theory, supported by evidence from Tales from the Pizzaplex, he suggests William pumped gas through the FNAF4 house to induce fear and hallucinations. This would make the nightmare animatronics not real, but not quite dreams either, chemically induced visions. The underground testing facility described in the books seems designed for exactly this kind of long-term psychological experimentation on children. Another possibility is that the nightmare animatronics are real, physical robots designed to look terrifying as part of the experiment. The bedroom is a controlled environment where these modified animatronics hunt Michael while William observes. This would explain the physical evidence of the testing facility while avoiding the complications of defining what's dream and what's hallucination. The timeline of when these experiments happened is also unclear. If Michael is the player, and they must take place after the crying child's death in 1983, possibly in the late 1980s or even the 1990s, but some evidence suggests they happen earlier, possibly even concurrent with the minigames. The exact chronological placement affects which interpretation makes sense. What makes this particularly frustrating is that FNAF 4 was marketed as the final chapter that would answer everything. Instead, it created more questions than any previous game. The community spent months trying to solve it, and when Scott said they'd missed something, the search intensified. Years later, we still don't have a definitive, universally accepted explanation for what the FNAF4 gameplay actually represents. The different theories have significant implications for understanding William Afton's character. If he experimented on his own sons, that adds a layer of cruelty beyond the child murders. If the nightmares are purely the crying child's fear made manifest, that's a more psychological horror angle. If they're Michael's guilty nightmares, that develops his character differently. Each interpretation changes how we understand the Afton family dynamic and the depth of William's evil. Scott's later comments about using sister location to clear up misconceptions from FNAF 4 suggest he provided additional context meant to guide interpretation. But the community took that context in multiple directions, with some seeing it as proof of the experiment theory and others interpreting it differently. The ambiguity seems at least partially intentional, but there's a line between deliberate mystery and unclear storytelling, and FNAF4 might have crossed it, in community theories that became truth. The FNAF community's relationship with theorizing is unique in gaming. Due to Scott Cawthon's indirect communication style and the game's cryptic storytelling, fan theories have played an outsized role in shaping the accepted lore. Some theories have become so prevalent that they're treated as fact, even when they've never been definitively confirmed. This creates a strange situation where the line between canon and fanon becomes blurred. MatPat's game theory videos are the most visible example of this phenomenon. His FNAF theories have been watched millions of times, and for many fans, they represent the definitive explanation of the lore. MatPat has directly communicated with Scott Cawthon, receiving guidance and correction on his theories, which lends them additional credibility. Scott has acknowledged MatPat's work multiple times, confirming some theories and gently steering him away from others. But here's the problem. Even when MatPat gets things wrong, his theories become embedded in the community consciousness. The crying child is Michael Afton theory, was popularized by game theory and held as truth by many fans for years, even though it was later disproven when Sister Location confirmed Michael and the crying child were different people. The theory made sense at the time with available evidence, but treating it as confirmed fact before confirmation led to confusion when later games contradicted it. Other theories have followed similar paths. The idea that Phone Guy's William Afton was popular early in the franchise despite being contradicted by evidence. The dream theory for FNAF4, as mentioned earlier, became so widespread that Scott had to directly address it. The theory that Mangle caused the bite of 87 is widely accepted but never actually confirmed, based on circumstantial evidence and popular belief, rather than explicit revelation. This creates a problem for new fans trying to understand the lore. They watch theory videos, read wiki summaries, and absorb what they think is confirmed canon, only to later discover that some of it is actually speculation presented as fact. The FNAF wiki tries to maintain distinctions between confirmed information and theories, but in discussions on Reddit, YouTube comments, and Discord servers, these lines get blurred. Part of the issue is that Scott's communication style encourages this. He rarely provides direct confirmations, preferring to let the community theorize and discover. And when he does comment, it's often cryptic or partial confirmation rather than explicit answers. This approach creates engagement and discussion, but it also means that community consensus can drift away from intended canon if Scott doesn't correct it, and sometimes he doesn't. The William Afton always comes back meme exemplifies this. The phrase isn't directly from the games. It's the community's interpretation of William's repeated returns as Springtrap, Scraptrap, and potentially Glitchtrap and Burntrap. It's become such a fundamental part of FNAF culture that it's treated as an established fact about his character, even though it's more observation than lore. When the mimic was revealed to possibly be behind Glitchtrap and Burntrap, the community struggled because Afton always comes back was so ingrained as truth. The community has also collectively decided certain timeline placements and event chronologies that might not be officially confirmed. The idea that FNAF 2 is a prequel to FNAF 1 is strongly supported by evidence and generally accepted, but there are still timeline placements and details within that framework that are community consensus rather than explicit confirmation. the exact years of events, the order of certain incidents, which restaurants opened when. Much of this is the community's best guess presented as fact. This isn't necessarily a bad thing. Fan communities creating consensus around interpretations of ambiguous media is normal and can enhance enjoyment. The problem arises when this consensus becomes so strong that alternative interpretations are dismissed, or when the community forgets that some facts are actually theories. It creates an environment where correcting misconceptions becomes difficult because everyone knows something, even if it's not actually confirmed. Scott's occasional confirmations or denials through Reddit posts, interviews, or game content create interesting dynamics. When he confirms something the community theorized, like Michael being the player in FNAF 1 and 3, it validates the theorizing process. When he denies something, like the dream theory, it forces re-evaluation. But his silence on many theories leaves them in limbo, neither confirmed nor denied, existing in a state of probable truth without certainty. The upcoming Secret of the Mimic game might face challenges because of this. If it contradicts community consensus about the Mimic's role or William's fate, a backlash seems likely. But if it simply confirms what everyone already believes, it might feel redundant. Navigating the space between what fans think they know and what's actually canon requires careful storytelling. What we'll never know. After examining all the unsolvable mysteries, timeline contradictions, and ambiguous lore, a sobering realization emerges. There are aspects of the FNAF story we will genuinely never know for certain. Not because we haven't theorized hard enough or looked closely enough at the evidence, but because the answers either don't exist anymore, were never fully developed, or are lost to the organic, improvisational nature of the franchise's growth. We'll never know what was originally supposed to be in the box. Scott himself admitted he can't remember, and even if he comes up with something retroactively, and it won't be what he planned in 2015, that answer is gone, lost to time and the evolution of his creative process. The box exists now as a symbol of the franchise's limits, a reminder that not every mystery has a solution waiting to be uncovered. We'll never know which detail was the one true retcon Scott mentioned. He's not going to tell us, and even if someone correctly guesses it, we won't get confirmation. This means any timeline or lore interpretation has to account for the possibility that crucial details might have been changed without our knowledge. It introduces permanent uncertainty into theorizing. We'll likely never get full clarification on exactly which book content is canon to the games and which isn't. Scott's statements suggest different stories exist in different continuity corners, but he hasn't provided a clear guide to which is which. This means debates about using book evidence will continue indefinitely, with no authoritative answer available. The exact nature of William Afton's motivations remains unclear. Why did he kill children? Was it purely for experimentation with Remnant, as later games suggest? Was it revenge against Henry? Was he trying to achieve immortality? The games hint at various motivations but never explicitly state his driving force. Some of this ambiguity might be intentional to keep him mysterious and threatening, but it also means we can't definitively answer what made him commit his crimes. The crying child's name is still unknown. Despite being a central figure in FNAF 4 and crucial to understanding the Afton family tragedy, we don't know what his name was. Some theorists believe it's hidden in the survival logbook or other materials, but nothing has been definitively confirmed. He exists as the crying child or bite victim, a character defined by his trauma rather than his identity. Whether FNAF 4's gameplay is dreams, experiments, hallucinations, or something else might never be conclusively resolved. The evidence supports multiple interpretations, and Scott's hints have guided rather than dictated understanding. This is a case where ambiguity might be the point, but it leaves a major portion of the story open to interpretation. The ultimate fate of many spirits and characters remains unclear. What happened to the missing children after the Happiest Day minigame? Did they find peace? Are they still around in some form? What about Charlotte? Where did the Funtime animatronic spirits go after Ennard ejected them? These questions might not have answers because the games moved on to new stories before resolving old threads. The full extent of Fazbear Entertainment's knowledge about the hauntings and Williams' crimes is unknown. Did they know the animatronics were possessed? Were they covering up murders or genuinely ignorant? Phone Guy's calls suggest corporate awareness of problems, but the depth of that knowledge is ambiguous. This affects how we view the company as complicit or simply unfortunate. Technical details about how possession, remnant, and agony actually work in this universe remain vague, despite books providing some explanation. The exact mechanics are unclear enough that fans can disagree about fundamental aspects of the law's supernatural elements. And can any object be possessed? Is remnant a physical substance or metaphysical? How does agony differ from remnant? These questions have partial answers but not complete ones. The connection between the various FNAF locations and whether they're all part of one timeline or represent different continuities is still debated. The movie presents an alternate version. The books have their version. And even within the games, some spin-offs might not connect to the main continuity. Where each piece fits in the broader FNAF multiverse isn't always clear. Perhaps most frustratingly, we don't know if future games will clarify past mysteries or continue leaving them ambiguous. Secret of the Mimic might answer questions about the Mimic's nature and role, or it might introduce new mysteries without resolving old ones. The franchise could continue indefinitely, each entry adding layers without ever providing the comprehensive answers fans seek. This isn't necessarily a failure of storytelling. Some of the best horror works leave questions unanswered, maintaining mystery and allowing audience interpretation. But FNAF exists in a weird space where it seems like answers should exist, where the level of detail and the hidden lore suggests Scott had everything planned out. But the reality is messier. The franchise grew organically, changed direction, adapted to community reactions, and evolved beyond its original scope. In that process, some threads got dropped, some details got lost, and some mysteries became truly unsolvable. The community has largely accepted this reality, even if it's disappointing. A modern FNAF theorizing acknowledges the limitations and unknowns while still trying to piece together the most coherent interpretation possible. The debates continue, the theories evolve, and new games provide new context that sometimes clarifies and sometimes confuses. That's FNAF. It always has been. Conclusion. So here we are, over a decade into Five Nights at Freddy's, surrounded by mysteries that range from deliberately cryptic to genuinely lost. The franchise that started as a simple indie horror game about surviving the night shift has evolved into a sprawling multimedia universe with games, books, a movie, and more lore than any single person can fully master. And yet, despite all this content, despite thousands of hours of community theorizing, despite Scott Cawthon's occasional guidance, fundamental questions remain unanswered. The box stays locked, not because we haven't found the key, but because the key might not exist anymore. the one true retcon remains unidentified, leaving a shadow of doubt over every detail. The books exist in ambiguous relationship to the games, useful for understanding concepts, but unreliable as canonical evidence. The timeline contradicts itself in ways that no amount of careful arrangement can fully resolve. Security breach fractured the lore in ways that even its DLC couldn't completely repair. The Mimic's role as William's successor remains controversial and unclear. But here's the thing. FNAF's unsolvability might be essential to its enduring appeal. If everything was neatly explained, definitively answered, and perfectly consistent, would the community still be this engaged a decade later? The mysteries, even the frustrating ones, keep people coming back. The debates drive discussion. The ambiguity allows for creative interpretation and personal connection to the story. Scott Cawthon created something remarkable, even if it wasn't always what he intended to create. The story evolved organically, changed in response to community engagement, and grew far beyond its original scope. In that growth, some threads were lost, some questions became unanswerable, and some mysteries transformed into something that might not have solutions. That's not ideal from a lore perspective, but it's beautifully human. Stories change as they're told. Creators forget details. Ambitions expand beyond original plans. The FNAF story we got isn't the one we were meant to solve, because it isn't a single cohesive puzzle with one correct solution. And it's a living narrative that's been written across years, across media, across changes in creative vision and team composition. It's a collaboration between creator and community, where fan theories influenced future installments, where mysteries were adjusted based on reception, where the journey of discovery became more important than the destination of answers. Maybe that's okay. Maybe the FNAF story we were never meant to solve is actually the FNAF story we were always meant to experience. Messy, contradictory, ambitious, and endlessly fascinating. The questions might not all have answers, but asking them together has created something special. A shared experience of mystery, horror, and speculation that's brought together millions of fans across the world. If you've made it this far down the rabbit hole with me, I hope you've enjoyed this exploration of FNAF's unsolvable mysteries. If you'd like to see more deep dives into the lore, theories, and unanswered questions of this franchise, consider subscribing. And let me know in the comments which FNAF mystery frustrates you the most, which contradiction bothers you, or which unanswered question you wish Scott would finally address. Until next time, stay curious, keep theorizing, and remember, in FNAF, some things really are best left forgotten.